Hello and welcome to MagicGatheringStrat. I'm Peyton. I'm here with our weekly top 10 list. It's the top 10 EDH Generals around which to build budget decks, or in its shortened form, the top 10 Budget EDH Generals. These are good creatures, some are relatively underplayed, and you can build great decks without dropping... Go away. Without dropping lots of money for them. Sorry about that. Anyways, we'll take a look at the preface here. As usual, it is not the perfect list. I only cover a few choices for the budget generals. There are a lot of good ones out there, so I totally want to hear your comments. I love the feedback. I love that I get a lot of it, even if I don't have a chance to reply to some of it. It's always good to hear from you guys. I do read 99% of what goes in the comments and what goes on Reddit and stuff, so thank you very much. I don't believe I've been mentioning this in my previous videos, but there are articles about all of the top 10 videos that come out a couple days afterwards. So if you want to check those out, essentially the video in text form, you are welcome to do so. Just thought I'd mention that. I would also like to extend a giant thank you to everyone who watched last week's video. It was the most popular video on the channel last week, and that's when it went up. And it basically got 1,100 views overnight. It went from 300, and now I believe it's hovering somewhere around 1,700. It's really, really, really high view count, guys. Thank you so much for having a look at it. It's been the most successful top 10 thus far. Same with the article. It's amazing. We shattered the record on the website for the most views in the first 24 hours that the article is up, achieving approximately 7,500. Right now, it is sitting pretty at almost 10,000. That's an insane view count. I just thank you so much for having a look. I thank you for your opinion in the comments. And now I'm going to quit thanking you and launch into the honorable mentions. Yay. Alright, so the first honorable mention is Reki, the History of Kamigawa. Reki himself is a cheap creature. He's not that expensive to pick up as a card. The main issue is the cards he plays best with are really, really expensive. Cards like Rofelos, Yenawar Emissary, and Vorinclex, Voice of Hunger. Those aren't cheap cards. If you want to get the most value out of a Reki deck, you gotta play the expensive Green Legends. I really do love the ability. I think he's well costed. His mana cost is low. You can drop him just turn 2 with a mana elf, but unfortunately he works better with better cards. The next choice for an honorable mention may be a little bit controversial, and I'm expecting this, and this is Zur the Enchanter. Zur is probably the most feared one-on-one EDH general because he's very resilient and he's very hard to deal with, which is the same thing. I'm sorry, I can't believe I just repeated that. Anyways, but he's also very powerful. The main issue with the Zur decks is not necessarily Zur himself, although there is quite a chunk of a budget taking out if you're playing Zur. In paper, he's $13, $15 maybe, and online he's about 10. So Zur, if you're trying to play for $50 budget deck in EDH, already slashes part of your budget. A fair chunk of it as well if you're trying for about $50. And the cards that support him best are generally expensive ones. A lot of the competitive Zur decks are running Force of Will, Ancestral Recall, Mana Drain, those expensive cards, and the mana base as well is generally not greedy, but requires money to be pumped into it. You need 3 colors on turn 4, which can be difficult without fetches and duels and stuff. So, while Zur may be a powerful general, if you want a super competitive Zur deck, you have to put some money into it. Anyways, at number 10, we have got Balthor the Defiled. This dude right here, the only zombie dwarf legend in the game. That's a pretty cool creature type, if I do say so myself. Even with only 35 playable minions in the game, Balthor is a pretty powerful 1v1 and multiplayer general. It's not his minion ability that makes him valuable. It's his ability to basically have repeatable recursion of all the dead dudes. So if you have more dudes than your opponent, even if they kill all your guys, Balthor is going to bring him back. And then you can use Balthor again for 2 more mana each time. He can be good in multiplayer, especially if someone's playing a lot of board sweepers. And he's good in 1v1 too. Plus, he himself, he's only about $2-3 in paper. Relatively cheap, and it's fun just to build a mono black aggro deck around this guy. Number 9, we've got Bryon Stoutarm. He's probably a little bit more well known as a good budget general. I really like him in Boros. He only costs 4 mana on the 4/4 lifelinker, and his ability to essentially fling a creature at the opponent every turn for a negligible amount of mana is quite powerful. The lifelink is what really makes him good, because you could be consistently gaining life and dealing huge chunks of damage to the opponent. The Bryon player can play aggressively and try to rapidly deplete the opponent's life total, or they can play in a more controlling style by using lots of active treason type effects to steal the opponent's creatures, perhaps attack with them, and then use Bryon to shoot them in the face. So there's a lot of different ways you can play Bryon. He does not require a ridiculous mana base. This isn't 5 colors. You can play with all the plains and mountains you want, and you will generally never be color screwed. Number 8 is Thada Adel, Acquisitor. Thada is a little strange. She's definitely cheap herself. We're looking at the cost of the general as a card, as well as the cost of the deck you can build around the general. The nice thing about Thada is that you don't have to play all those expensive artifacts. You can let your opponent play the Wormcoil Engine, you can attack them with Thada, and then you can play their Wormcoil Engine. So not only are you denying them the Wormcoil Engine, but you're using it yourself. Island Walk is the most relevant part of Thada. If her ability was simply when she deals damage you can search for the card, that would be pretty bad. But the fact that you have cards like Spreading Seas and Convincing Mirage, Aquatex Will, to make the decks that aren't playing blue make Thada unblockable, that's pretty powerful. But you can essentially just play a, kind of a draw-go deck, but not really. Once again, there's a lot of different ways you could go. You could play kind of a Merfolk tribal theme. You could go counterspells.deck. All kinds of ways to play with Thada, but it's mostly around stealing artifacts and all that good stuff that goes with it. So, for number 7, we've got Planna, Nomad Captain. Planna is my personal choice for a white weenie type deck. You could argue for Krovax, Ascendant Hero, because he doesn't have to attack and he makes all of their white creatures bigger, and he makes non-white creatures smaller, and you can have him dodge removal by simply paying 2 life. But I personally prefer Planna. Even though she's a little bit weaker, and yes, Planna is a girl, her mana cost is quite a bit less than Krovax. You can play her many turns earlier. Krovax has CMC 6. And you can just swarm the board quickly with tokens after Planna hits play. She's also cheaper than Krovax by a few cents, if that really makes the difference for you grinders. I personally love Planna, but you could play Krovax either way. White Weenie is a pretty cheap deck to play on a budget. So, for number 6, we have got Wrexial, the Risen Deep. This guy is a bit near and dear to my heart. I do have a Wrexial budget deck. I wrote about that and did a video on that previously. But I just love that he's a 5/8 for 6. He's hard to block with Island Walk and Swamp Walk. There's a pretty good chance that the EDH deck you're playing against will have an island and or a swamp in play. So Wrexial's not going to get blocked. And then you can basically skimp on purchasing all those fancy instants and sorceries for yourself and use your opponents. Good times. You can play it like I do and go for a mill discard theme, make them pitch all their stuff and then reuse it. Or you can just play let's make them use their own stuff and use it against them and go for counter spells and the like. All kinds of ways to play with Wrexial. Generally though, I would recommend a mill and discard theme. He's pretty cheap. He was printed not only in World Wake, but also in the Commander set, so you can pick him up for, I don't know, maybe 50 cents or less. So I recommend Wrexial. He's very fun to play if you're a blue-black control player, or if you want to play Mill in EDH. Then again, if you want to play Mill in EDH, you should probably play Phoenix. Even so, number 5 is Guafa Hazid, Profiteer. Guafa is also a stranger choice. His effect isn't very game-breaking. He's very, very good in multiplayer games. You can play him on turn 3, and then you can start getting value off of him, not only by shutting down attackers, but also political value. In a 4-player game, when you're getting ganged up on because, oh, I don't know, maybe you're presenting some kind of threats, which you probably aren't by the time you play Guafa. Never mind, that was a really terrible analogy. I'm thinking of something completely different. But anyways, you can help out someone who's mana screwed by letting them draw a card while putting the bribery counter on something like a Yanawar Elf, where they're using the activated ability probably more than they are attacking or blocking with their 1/1. Unfortunately, you can't put a bribery counter on Guafa himself, or any of your own creatures, or else he would be a draw machine. But he's fun. You can get some politics going by helping players out. You can stop attackers. You can stop blockers. You can play counter magic. You can play all that good blue-white control-y goodness. And he's super cheap, too. So number 4, we're starting to get into the realm where it's getting less, oh, this guy's cute. He's got some good abilities. Let's play him because he's cheap. And more into the, this is starting to get competitive. Let's do this. Number 4 is Krenko, Mob Boss. Tribal Goblins, baby. Tribal Goblins. Even without playing the super expensive goblins like the Sharpshooter and the Pile Driver, it's not hard to put together a cheap goblins list with Krenko. He himself is maybe 350 right now in paper, and he just swarms the board. If you saw my top 10 infinite mana combos, Krenko and his buddy Umbral Mantle made the #1 spot. If you play Umbral Mantle in the deck, you can potentially make, oh, I don't know, a lot of goblins, maybe? A couple hundred? A couple thousand? You know, as many as you want. So Krenko can be super powerful. He can clog up the board if you don't deal with him. And it's also fun to have an arbitrarily large number of tiny 1/1 goblins. Anyways, in number 3 we have Skittles, aka Skithiryx the Blight Dragon. So Skithiryx is also fairly well known as a budget general, but I think Skithiryx is very powerful even if you don't build the super controlling black Skithiryx deck. You can put together a Skithiryx deck for 30-40 bucks. You don't have to revolve it around winning with infect damage with Skithiryx. You can basically play a mono black control or a mono black aggro deck and have this guy as part of the win condition in case your opponent doesn't have an answer to him. He regenerates, he can be hasty, and he can win the game potentially in 2 attacks if you equip him with basically anything. So Skithiryx is very powerful, and it's not hard to build a budget deck with this guy. If he were black and green, that would be a little bit better. We could pack some more infecty dudes and go for an infect theme, but even in mono black, Skithiryx is very powerful. So number 2 here, we have got Ruric Thar the Unbowed. Okay, so maybe this guy isn't the super competitive EDH general that everyone's looking for, but he punishes a lot of decks. It is not hard to get turn 3 or 4 Ruric in a green and red deck just by playing Mana Dorks. And while I wouldn't recommend necessarily playing an all creatures Ruric deck, you can basically play a lot of creatures and then, oh, maybe 1 explosive vegetation or something. Ruric Thar basically just punishes those blue decks, the white decks, the decks that aren't playing all creatures. While I'm not a big fan of him having to attack every turn, and I think having haste would possibly be better than him having reach, it would fit the theme of a giant unbowing guy a little bit better, Ruric is certainly very powerful, and it will just flat out lock some decks out of the game. I played a game with a Ruric deck once where I was able to get turn 3 Ruric Thar before my opponent was able to cast their Hokori Dust Drinker. And at that point, a lot of Hokori decks are playing a very stacksy build, where they want to play a lot of non-creatures and try to lock you out of the game. Well, at that point, he hadn't staxed me out, and every time he tried, he lost 6 life, plus the 6 from Ruric every turn since he had no blockers, and I was willing to pay for the Ghostly Prison. His damage can get out of hand very, very fast, so I'm a real big fan of Ruric Thar. I absolutely love how he works. But enough of that, dude. let's check out the number 1 spot. This is the one that we've all been waiting for because I saved the one that's essentially the replacement for Zur on a budget for number 1 since I think it's the best personally, and this is Uriel the Miststalker. Oh yes, 5/5 for 5 with Troll Shroud or Hexproof for those of you who are perhaps more acquainted with that term. Before it was Hexproof, it was Troll Shroud because trolls had it and it was like a one-sided shroud. Yay, magic history lesson. Anyways, it's that secondary ability basically. You can make Uriel absolutely massive if they do not have an answer that is a sacrifice effect or bounce or something. Uriel will absolutely dominate a game. He's ridiculously powerful, he's relatively cheap, and you can basically play Naya auras with a bunch of creatures and a bunch of auras and win just by smashing with this guy. Really, really powerful. I totally recommend making a Uriel deck if you're looking for a powerful budget EDH deck. There's a bunch of lists out there, and this guy gets giant really fast. Unfortunately, there are not a whole lot of ways to make creatures unblockable in the Naya color scheme, but who cares? Because you can put Whisper Silk Cloak on this guy. Anyways, that's all for this list. I want to know what you think, so post comments, suggest your top 10s. Thanks again, guys, for making that last week's video and article really, really popular. I appreciate your comments and everything, and I hope to see you guys next week with another top 10.